So how does an academic historian read a text like the Bible, especially when it comes to the supernatural? We're going to dive deep into that today. Now, this isn't about faith or theology. We're putting on our historian hats and looking at the historical method. So how does a historian analyze a miracle? Let's find out. And that brings us to a really fascinating question. Could just one single mistranslated word actually change the course of history? I mean, it sounds like something out of a detective novel, right? And in a lot of ways, that's exactly what this is. We're about to become literary detectives. Okay, so here's the fundamental challenge. The historical method, by its very nature, is limited to explaining things through natural cause and effect. So when a historian is faced with a claim of, say, divine intervention, they can't prove or disprove it. Instead, they have to ask questions they can answer, like, where did this story come from? And what purpose did it serve for the people who told it? So let's get our hands dirty and see how this works in the real world. We're going to start by cracking the textual code behind one of the most famous supernatural claims of all, the virgin birth. You know, historians have traced this whole idea back to a single Hebrew word. It's from an Old Testament prophecy in the book of Isaiah, and the word is Alma. This one little word, it's the textual seed that would eventually grow into a core belief for millions. But here's the crucial link in the chain. The author of Matthew's Gospel probably wasn't reading the original Hebrew. See, at the time, early Christians were mostly using the Septuagint, which was the popular Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. And this translation step, it is absolutely everything to this story. And this is where it all clicks. In that Greek translation, the Hebrew word alma, which really just means young woman, was translated as parthenos. And parthenos, well, that word specifically means virgin. So just like that, a prophecy about a young woman having a child became, in the version early Christians were reading, a prophecy about a virgin giving birth. To a historian, this looks a lot less like a direct historical account and more like a later reinterpretation of Scripture. And you know what backs this up even more? We only have two stories about Jesus' birth in the Gospels, and when you put them side by side, they're wildly different. Matthew gives us wise men and a dramatic escape to Egypt. Luke gives us shepherds and a quiet trip back home. For scholars, these huge differences suggest that the stories weren't meant to be a single, unified history, but were probably independent theological creations, each making its own point. Okay, so that's the text. But historians don't just look at the words on a page, they look at the world those words were written in. So let's zoom out and explore the social context of the first century Mediterranean, because it was a pretty wild place. The first thing you have to understand is that the ancient world was just swimming in miracle stories. The basic types of stories we see in the Gospels, divine births, incredible healings, power over nature, these were actually common literary tropes in Greco-Roman biographies about famous leaders or heroes. So the kind of story being told would have felt totally familiar and culturally normal to a first-century audience. But, and this is a big but, there was a very, very fine line to walk. In the ancient world, if you performed wonders, you could be seen as a divine man, or you could be condemned as a magician. And the key difference was the source of your power. That's why the gospel writers are so careful to frame Jesus' power as coming directly from God and linked to faith. They had to specifically distance him from the very serious accusation of sorcery. So when you look at it through the eyes of a sociologist or a historian, these miracle stories served one absolutely critical function. In the busy, competitive, religious marketplace of the Roman Empire, stories of supernatural power were like the necessary social currency. They were the tangible proof of divine favor that could legitimize a new religious movement and really make it stand out from the crowd. All right, let's take one more step back and look at our final layer of analysis. We've done text, we've done society. Now let's look at the bigger picture, comparative mythology. So the whole field of comparative mythology was really kicked off with famous works like Sir James Frazer's The Golden Bough. He came up with this idea that cultures all over the world shared a universal myth, this story of a dying and rising god, usually connected to the seasons and agriculture. For decades, this idea was hugely influential. But things have changed. Modern scholarship is much more critical of that approach. The feeling now is that Frazer and others like him tended to overgeneralize. They'd kind of cherry-pick bits and pieces from different myths, sometimes out of context, just to make them fit into this one single theory. Today, the focus is on much more careful and nuanced comparisons.
And this brings us right to the modern debate over the resurrection, which is a really polarized field of study. So one camp argues that any parallels to pagan myths are pretty superficial. They'll point out that gods like Osiris didn't physically come back to life on Earth. He became king of the underworld. But the other side argues that even if the details are different, the shared theme of death and rebirth was so common that it provided the cultural language, the framework, that allowed the Christian claim to even make sense in the first place.
Okay, so we've looked at text, society, and myth. Let's put all of these pieces together now and build a coherent, scholarly model for how historians actually understand these narratives. And this four-step model really sums up the academic perspective perfectly. It starts with a historical core, a real person, a charismatic teacher. Then, over time, oral traditions are shaped through what's called theological redaction. Those stories then serve a sociological function. They provide legitimacy. And finally, the whole thing exists within a broader mythic framework, using a cultural language that people understand. See, the focus isn't on proving or disproving the events, but on understanding how the stories themselves came to be. And this quote just hits the nail on the head. For an academic historian, the job isn't to be a theologian, and it's not to be a debunker. The entire goal of this historical critical method is to explain the genesis, that is, the origin, and the function, the purpose, of these incredibly powerful narratives within their own historical world. So, what's the big takeaway here? This scholarly method gives us a really powerful lens for understanding ancient texts. And it leaves us with one final, crucial question to chew on. How does understanding where a story comes from affect the power it holds? Now, that's something we're thinking about. Thanks for joining us.